predator becomes prey in the Florida Everglades as hundreds of hunters descend on the Sunshine State to catch and kill as many Burmese pythons.
Deep in a Florida preserve, a trail camera catches something that shouldn't be possible. A 25-pound native bobcat standing over the headless body of a 13-foot, 52-pound Burmese python. For 20 years, these giant invaders have been the undisputed monster of the swamp. Now, something is pushing back. And it isn't the only surprise buried in the wreckage. For decades, the story of the Everglades has been told as a single, simple disaster. The python invasion. Total and unstoppable. But recent research reveals something the headlines never covered. A hidden second invader riding inside the first one. A conservation plan so strange it was mocked on national television. And a native predator that may be starting to learn. The pythons are still here, but they're no longer the whole story. Florida's great mistake. Before any of this, the Everglades was one of the most productive wetland systems on the planet. A river of grass, as writer and conservationist Marjorie Stoneman Douglas famously called it in her 1947 book of the same name, a book credited with turning the swamp from a nuisance to be drained into a landscape worth protecting. It stretched across roughly 1.5 million acres, a slow-moving sheet of water feeding an ecosystem so productive that a 2020 University of Florida economic analysis valued its services, flood control, water filtration, fisheries, tourism, at well over $31 billion a year. Water that eventually supplies drinking sources for close to 9 million South Floridians. The sky itself told the story of its health. Wading birds, wood storks, herons, roseate spoonbills once gathered in numbers so large that early 20th century accounts describe flocks that darkened the horizon. Bobcats and the endangered Florida panther worked the tree islands known as hammocks. Marsh rabbits and raccoons moved openly through the sawgrass. Nobody who studied this place imagined it could unravel within a single human generation. It didn't begin with one storm. It began earlier, with a legal loophole. Burmese pythons became legal. Low-cost exotic pets in the United States starting in the 1970s, and by the 1980s and 90s, they were a booming segment of the reptile trade, with hatchlings selling for as little as $20. The problem owners quickly discovered is that a hatchling that fits in your palm can reach 10 feet and 50 pounds within a few years, and top out beyond 20 feet and 200 pounds, strong enough to take an adult deer. Overwhelmed and unprepared, some owners simply drove to the edge of the wetlands and released them. Then, in August 1992, Hurricane Andrew arrived, a Category 5 storm with sustained winds near 165 miles per hour, one of the costliest hurricanes in U.S. history at the time. Among the thousands of structures it leveled near Homestead was a reptile breeding and import facility. In the chaos, an unknown number of captive Burmese pythons escaped directly into the wetlands, compounding years of piecemeal releases into a single sudden influx. Herpetologists have long debated how much weight to put on each factor. Genetic studies published in the 2010s, including work led by University of Florida researchers, actually traced the entire established Everglades population back to a surprisingly small founding group, suggesting the invasion's explosive growth had less to do with sheer numbers released, and more to do with what happened once a handful of survivors found a landscape with no natural checks at all. And that absence of checks is exactly where the disaster accelerated. For years, isolated sightings were dismissed as curiosities. Nobody grasped what the pythons had actually found: a subtropical paradise engineered, almost perfectly, for their survival. The heat and humidity matched their native Southeast Asian range. The prey had no evolutionary memory of a predator like this, no fear response built in over thousands of generations. And the python itself is an extraordinary piece of biological engineering, capable of holding its breath underwater for more than 30 minutes, camouflaged almost perfectly into sawgrass, and equipped with heat-sensing pits along its jaw that let it track a warm-blooded animal in absolute darkness. A single female can lay up to 100 eggs in a clutch. With no predator adapted to stop them, the population didn't just grow, it went exponential. And current scientific estimates range anywhere from the tens of thousands up into the hundreds of thousands across South Florida, a range so wide it's itself a sign of how little control anyone actually has. The clearest proof of what this did to the ecosystem came in 2012, when biologist Michael Dorcas and a team of collaborators published a landmark study in the Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences, based on nighttime road surveys conducted across the Everglades over more than 2 decades. In areas where pythons were most established, raccoon sightings had collapsed by 99.3%, opossums by 98.9%, and bobcats by 87.5%. In the hardest-hit zones, rabbits and foxes had essentially disappeared from the surveys entirely. Researchers and hunters who'd worked the loop roads for decades described a landscape gone eerily quiet. Routes where you once had to slow for crossing raccoons, now empty for miles. The foundation of the Everglades food web had been hollowed out from below, and officials were only beginning to understand what they were up against. The unwinnable war. By the time Florida moved to respond, the imbalance was already staggering, and the state's opening strategy looked, to much of the public, more like a stunt than a plan. In 2013, wildlife officials launched the Florida Python Challenge, an open competition inviting members of the public to hunt and remove pythons for cash prizes, including a $10,000 top award. It became an annual event drawing hundreds of participants, including out-of-state hunters flying in specifically for the competition. In 2024, more than 800 participants combined to remove 195 pythons. In 2025, that number rose to a new competition record of 294. The optics were great. The math was brutal. Even using the most conservative population estimate of 100,000 pythons, a single year's competition haul represented roughly 0.3% of the population, a number so small it barely qualifies as containment, let alone control. Recognizing the limits of a public contest, the South Florida Water Management District turned to professional contractors starting in 2017, paying career hunters an hourly wage to work levees and remote habitat year-round. That program, combined with all state, federal, and private removal efforts, has taken more than 23,000 pythons out of the wild to date, a genuinely massive number of animal hours invested, and still, by most estimates, under 5% of the total population. Technology fared even worse. Drones equipped with thermal cameras struggled because pythons are ectothermic, cold-blooded, meaning a resting snake often reads no differently to a thermal lens than a sun-warmed rock or mud bank, and the Everglades' dense mangrove canopy blocks clean aerial views regardless. Robotic decoy rabbits, engineered to emit heat and motion to lure ambush predators into range, failed for a more basic reason. Pythons hunt by waiting motionless for real prey to cross their path, and showed little interest in an artificial one. The method that actually worked came out of the Conservancy of Southwest Florida, where wildlife biologist Ian Bartoshek has led a radiotelemetry program since 2013 using what the field calls scout snakes, sexually mature male pythons fitted with surgically implanted transmitters and released back into the population during breeding season, where their own instinct to seek out females leads researchers directly to the largest, most reproductively active individuals. Over more than a decade, Bartoszek's team has used this method to remove upwards of 1,000 pythons weighing more than 30,000 pounds combined from a single 200-square-mile study area, including, in one landmark season, a female that set the state record at nearly 18 feet and 215 pounds. It's precise, and it works, but it's also slow and resource-intensive. A method built for quality over volume in a fight that fundamentally needs volume. Field biologists have also reported behavior that reads, at minimum, as troubling. Pythons that seem to avoid heavily trafficked levees, scout snakes that lead trackers on long, circuitous routes for months at a time. Researchers are careful not to overstate this as calculated evasion rather than simple, unpredictable wild movement. But the pattern has been persistent enough that it's become a genuine open question inside the removal programs themselves. Is an apex predator dropped into a landscape with zero natural threats, capable of behaviorally adapting to the one predator it does face? Us? By the early 2020s, officials had largely stopped talking about eradication and started talking about permanent management, an admission that this fight, on its own terms, had already been lost. But the visible war for the swamp's mammals wasn't the only front. A second one had already opened, and almost nobody outside a small group of parasitologists had noticed. The invisible enemy. While hunters chased 20-foot snakes through sawgrass, something microscopic was doing arguably more lasting damage. University of Florida and Stetson University researchers, including parasitologist Terry Farrell, began finding native Florida snakes, garter snakes, pygmy rattlesnakes, water snakes, turning up emaciated, gasping, and on necropsy, packed with dozens to hundreds of small parasites clogging their airways. Here's a detail that even most coverage gets slightly wrong. This organism isn't technically a worm at all. Raeliatiella orientalis is a pentastome, an ancient, obscure group of parasitic crustaceans more closely related to arthropods than to true nematode lungworms, though the nickname snake lungworm has stuck in both scientific and popular use. It's native to Asia and parts of Africa, the same broad region as the Burmese python, and researchers believe it arrived in Florida already established inside the python population, having co-evolved with its original host closely enough that pythons rarely suffer serious harm from carrying it. The timeline of discovery is itself revealing. The parasite was first documented in Florida's wild Burmese pythons back in 2012, but it took until 2017 for researchers to confirm it had already jumped into 9 native snake species across 6 South Florida counties. The following year, biologists found it in pygmy rattlesnakes more than 160 kilometers north of the python's own established range, the first clear sign the parasite no longer needed pythons to keep moving. By spring 2019, it turned up in a water snake in Alachua County, deep in north-central Florida, hundreds of miles from the Everglades. Florida's native snakes have no evolutionary truce with this parasite. The life cycle is straightforward and brutal. An infected snake sheds eggs in its feces. Cockroaches and other invertebrates ingest the waste and become infected. Frogs and lizards eat the infected insects. And a native snake completes the cycle by eating the frog or lizard. Recent infection experiments have confirmed that common Florida anurans and lizards can indeed serve as this middle link in the chain, giving the parasite a wide menu of ways to keep spreading through the food web. Once inside a snake, the larvae don't stay in the digestive tract. They migrate through the stomach wall directly into the lungs, where they mature, feed, and reproduce, gradually choking the airway. Infected snakes have been documented with severe pneumonia, internal lesions, and, in advanced cases, parasites emerging from the mouth as the animal struggles to breathe. The spread has been faster and wider than researchers initially expected. A survey published in 2025 confirmed the parasite in 14 additional Florida counties, beyond what had previously been documented, extending its known range roughly 435 kilometers northwest into the Florida Panhandle. A jump researchers didn't anticipate happening this quickly. In that same round of sampling, close to 30% of the wild Florida snakes examined tested positive, with infection loads ranging from a single parasite up to 107 individual worm-like organisms packed into one animal's respiratory tract. As of the most recent published surveys, at least 18 native Florida snake species have tested positive, and the parasite's confirmed range now touches roughly 20 counties, with isolated detections as far as St. Johns County near Jacksonville, hundreds of miles beyond the python's own established range. There's also a human-assisted angle researchers are increasingly worried about. The same 2025 survey documented infected wild-caught snakes that had already entered the commercial pet trade, and biologists now suspect the reptile trade, along with the accidental transport of infected feeder insects and amphibians, may be helping the parasite leapfrog geography far faster than it could spread on its own. There is currently no formal biosecurity screening for this parasite anywhere in the pet trade, something the researchers behind the 2025 study explicitly flagged as an urgent gap. That gap between where pythons live and where the parasite now lives is the most unsettling part of the science. The pentastomy no longer needs pythons to keep spreading. It has fully established itself in native hosts and is now propagating snake to snake on its own, meaning even a hypothetical total removal of every python in Florida tomorrow would do nothing to stop it. Researchers caution against the most dramatic leap. A jump into mammals or humans is considered highly unlikely given what's known about pentastomy host specificity. But they're candid that host jumps are exactly what nobody predicted the first time either. One genuine point of scientific interest: some native species, including the Florida cottonmouth, appear comparatively resistant, and researchers are actively studying why, since understanding that resistance could eventually inform how vulnerable species might be protected. For now, there's no treatment and no way to reverse the spread. A second, quieter collapse layered directly on top of the first. With two crises running in parallel and a decade of expensive failures behind them, Florida's wildlife agencies turned to an idea so unconventional that when it became public, it made the state a punchline. A desperate gamble. The announcement, on paper, sounded absurd. Florida was releasing hundreds more snakes into the wild, specifically to help fight its snake problem. Social media reacted exactly as you'd expect: mockery, disbelief, instant comparisons to history's most infamous biological control failures. Those comparisons weren't unfair on their face. In 1935, Australian entomologist Reginald Montgomery introduced roughly 100 cane toads to Queensland sugar plantations to control cane beetles. The toads ignored the beetles almost entirely, multiplied into the hundreds of millions, and became a toxic, invasive plague still spreading across the continent 9 decades later. In 1872, small Indian mongooses were introduced to Jamaica's sugar estates to control rats, and the experiment was repeated in Hawaii starting in 1883. But because rats are nocturnal and mongooses hunt by day, the two species barely overlapped, and the mongoose instead devastated Hawaii's ground-nesting native birds. Both are now textbook case studies taught in wildlife management courses specifically as warnings against acting without full ecological modeling. But the snake Florida was releasing wasn't a new experiment. It was a restoration, and one that had already been quietly running for years before the public ever heard about it. The eastern indigo snake is North America's longest native snake species, capable of reaching 9 feet, with an iridescent blue-black sheen and a rust-orange throat patch. It's ophiophagous, meaning it preys on other snakes, and it carries a genuine biological rarity, apparent physiological resistance to the venom of North America's pit vipers, allowing it to hunt and eat rattlesnakes, copperheads, and cottonmouths without harm. It doesn't constrict its prey. It simply overpowers it with raw jaw strength and swallows it alive. Its historic range once stretched from South Carolina through Georgia, Florida, and into Mississippi. But 2 collapses gutted it. The longleaf pine forest that once covered nearly 90 million acres of the Southeast, one of the most biodiverse ecosystems in North America, according to research from the Longleaf Alliance and U.S. Forest Service, has been reduced by logging, development, and decades of fire suppression to roughly 3% of its original extent. And the eastern indigo depends almost entirely on burrows dug by the gopher tortoise, a keystone species whose tunnels shelter more than 350 other species from fire and cold. As tortoises were hunted for food, especially during the Great Depression, a period when indigo snakes sheltering in raided tortoise burrows were often killed on sight, the indigo's range collapsed alongside its hosts. By 1978, it was formally listed as threatened under the Endangered Species Act, and it had already vanished entirely from Alabama and North Florida. By the time reintroduction work began in earnest, the last confirmed sighting at the eventual release site dated back to 1982, more than 3 decades of complete absence. The reintroduction effort wasn't improvised in response to the python crisis. It predates the public's awareness of that crisis by years. Since 2017, a coalition led by the Nature Conservancy, the Central Florida Zoo's Orion Center for Indigo Conservation, the Orion Society, the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service's Welaka National Fish Hatchery, the Joseph W. Jones Ecological Research Center, and Florida Fish and Wildlife has been quietly breeding indigo snakes and releasing them into restored longleaf habitat at the Apalachicola Bluffs and Ravines Preserve in North Florida, hundreds of miles from the Everglades python stronghold, but squarely within the snake's historic ancestral range. Each snake spends roughly 2 years in human care before release, hatched and raised for its first year at the Central Florida Zoo, then moved to the Welaka Hatchery for a second year of growth before it's ever set loose. It's slow, careful, science-driven work, closer in spirit to a captive breeding program for a condor than to a pest control release. The public mockery missed that distinction almost entirely. The scale of the commitment is easy to underestimate from the outside. By the 9th annual release in the program, biologists had reintroduced close to 500 eastern indigo snakes, combined across the Florida site and a parallel release program in Alabama. At the Apalachicola Preserve alone, releases climbed from a dozen snakes in the program's earliest years to batches of over 40 snakes in a single spring release by 2024 and 2025, with each individual snake microchipped and tracked by a unique ID number. To monitor them, the team installed a network of 17 drift fence arrays wired with trail cameras and automatic pit tag readers positioned at the mouths of tortoise burrows, essentially a distributed sensor grid built to catch a snake passing through without ever having to recapture it by hand. That doesn't make the skeptic's underlying question irrelevant, though. Introducing any apex predator into an already destabilized system carries real risk, and researchers involved in the program have had to answer versions of the mongoose comparison directly. What happened next in the field would end up being the strongest answer they could offer. The three-way war. While the internet argued over the indigo release, nature in the Everglades had already started improvising its own response, and researchers caught it almost by accident. Biologists with the Conservancy of Southwest Florida were tracking a radio-tagged 13-foot, 52-pound male python named Loki, a nickname borrowed from the trickster god of Norse mythology, who legend has it was chained beneath a serpent for his crimes, as part of Bartoszek's ongoing Scout Snake program. The technique itself is a clever piece of biological jujitsu. Researchers surgically implant radio transmitters in male pythons and then release them, using the male's own instinct to seek out breeding females during mating season to lead the team straight to the far larger, far more reproductively significant females, which are then humanely euthanized. One December morning in 2022, a routine location check led them instead to Loki's body, sprawled in the grass near Naples. Decapitated, his head chewed off, buried nearby beneath a cache of pine needles. A trail camera set up at the site by wildcat expert David Schindel of the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service captured the culprit days later. A bobcat, weighing an estimated 25 pounds, roughly a 20th of its victim's size. Researchers and conservationists described it as the first confirmed case of a native Florida predator successfully killing an adult Burmese python of that size. Some noted that a recent cold snap likely slowed the python's reflexes, giving the bobcat an opening it might not otherwise have had, an important caveat against reading too much into a single event. It's also worth noting the relationship runs both directions. During a separate necropsy around the same period, Bartoszek's team found bobcat claws inside the stomach of another python, a reminder that pythons have preyed on bobcats plenty of times before this single kill flipped the script. But it wasn't the only data point. Alligators, the Everglades' original apex predator, have been documented ambushing and consuming smaller pythons on multiple occasions. Black bears have been recorded scavenging or preying on them, and even the endangered Florida panther, a population numbering only around 200 individuals statewide, has been recorded preying on invasive snakes. Whether this represents true social learning passed between individuals or simply opportunistic predation that happens more often as python density rises remains an open scientific question. But field biologists increasingly describe it, cautiously, as a genuine sign that some part of the native ecosystem hasn't simply surrendered. It's a fragile win, and it arrives against a backdrop that keeps reminding researchers just how formidable these snakes remain as predators. That same team, only months earlier, had published the first documented photographs of a wild Burmese python swallowing a nearly full-grown white-tailed deer weighing around 77 pounds, close to 70% of the snake's own body mass. A single bobcat kill does nothing to offset a population still measured in the tens or hundreds of thousands. But it landed at almost exactly the same time as a second piece of good news, one that had been building quietly for over a decade. In autumn 2023, trail cameras at the Ecological Bluffs and Ravines Preserve recorded something the reintroduction team had been working toward since 2017. Two wild-born eastern indigo hatchlings, offspring of previously released adults, confirmed as the first documented wild reproduction of the species in North Florida in roughly 40 years. Critically, one of the hatchlings carried no identifying tag, meaning it hadn't simply survived, It had been born, hunted, and grown entirely outside of direct human intervention. Through 2024 and 2025, monitoring teams confirmed additional individuals, including a healthy 6-foot adult male, moving confidently through restored habitat, alongside dozens of previously released snakes from earlier release cohorts still being tracked and thriving. The milestone wasn't isolated to Florida either. In 2022, a parallel reintroduction effort in Alabama's Conecuh National Forest recorded its own wild-hatched indigo snake, only the second such confirmation anywhere in that state in 60 years. To be direct about what this does and doesn't mean, the eastern indigo's restored population is concentrated hundreds of miles north of the Everglades python stronghold, and there is no current evidence the two species interact in the wild at any meaningful scale. This is not a solution to the python crisis. What it represents instead is proof that patient, well-funded habitat restoration, rebuilding longleaf pine forest, protecting gopher tortoise burrows, breeding a threatened species back from the edge, can still work, even inside a landscape that suffered as much ecological damage as the Everglades has. Meanwhile, the direct fight against the pythons themselves has been quietly accelerating on a completely different front. Florida's Python Action Team, running since 2017, has helped push the statewide total past 23,500 pythons removed since record-keeping began in 2000. The annual Florida Python Challenge, the state's public hunting competition, set a new record in 2025, with 934 participants pulling 294 snakes out of the Everglades over 10 days, nearly 50% more than the 195 removed the year before. A newer incentive partnership between the state and a leather goods company has tripled the monthly removal rate on its own, with 748 pythons pulled in July 2025 alone, compared with 235 in the same month the year prior. Bartoszek's team at the Conservancy of Southwest Florida, working almost entirely through the scout snake method that led them to Loki, has pulled more than 40,000 pounds, over 20 tons, of python out of the western Everglades since the program began in 2013. And still, a single female python can lay between 50 and 100 eggs in one clutch, which is the blunt arithmetic explaining why none of these numbers, however record-breaking, have come close to turning the tide. Where this leaves us. Put together, the honest picture of Florida's swamp is stranger and more layered than either total invasion or conservation victory alone. The pythons remain, likely uncontrollable in the near term by any method tried so far, even as removal totals climb into the tens of thousands, and hunting programs keep breaking their own records year after year. The pentastomy parasite they carried in has outgrown its origin and is now spreading on its own timeline, through native hosts and possibly through the pet trade, toward the northern edge of the state and into it. And two of the state's own native species, one an opportunistic survivor learning new prey, one a painstakingly restored icon finally breeding again in the wild, its range quietly expanding across two states, are showing that the ecosystem isn't simply lying down. The unresolved question is what happens as all three forces keep moving. The python's range continues creeping north, even as hunters remove more of them than ever before. The eastern indigo's restored range is, slowly, expanding south and spreading into Alabama. The pentastum is spreading in both directions at once, through whichever snake species it encounters next, aided in ways researchers are only beginning to document by human transport and the pet trade. Nobody currently studying this system can tell you with confidence what a collision between a recovering apex predator and an already established invasive parasite will look like, because it hasn't happened yet, anywhere, at scale. What the record actually shows isn't a monster movie with a clean ending. It's an ecosystem running three overlapping experiments at once, with humans responsible for starting all three and now able to fully control none of them. Whether that adds up to slow recovery or a longer, quieter reckoning is still being written in real time, one trail camera frame at a time. What do you think happens next in the swamp? Let us know in the comments. And subscribe for more of the science stories nobody else is covering.